Hi, good evening. My name is Dr. Cherie Hill, and I am the Physical and Mental Health Committee co-chair for the Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. I'm here this evening to welcome you to our February Mental Health Monday webinar series featuring Dr. Nadia Barnett and Dr. Jada. In just a moment, we will get into their bios, but wanted to remind you all that if you are watching us from YouTube or Facebook, feel free during the live session to leave questions on the chat. And if you're attending on the Zoom, feel free to use the Q&A box and we will get all of your questions to the panelists. All right, so first, I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Nadia Barnett. Dr. Barnett has over 15 years of clinical counseling experience, encompassing both public, private, inpatient, and outpatient setting here in the Atlanta metro area. Within these settings, she has been able to conduct intake assessments, crisis counseling and management, and offer mental health counseling for individuals, families, and groups. She's currently a faculty member within the Department of Human Services and Psychology at Mercer University. Welcome, Dr. Nadia. Next, we have Dr. Jada Ruffin. She is a primary care physician specializing in bariatric medicine and hormone therapy. She has a passion-filled and purpose-driven practice and has touched thousands of lives through her career as a physician and servant leader. She was called to medicine at the age of 15 and has never looked back. Affectionately known as Dr. Jada, she engages, educates, empowers, and encourages all who she encounters to live a healthy, fulfilling, high-impact life. Welcome to both of our panelists.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So tonight, the subject that we'll be talking about is addiction, substances, sex, food, and everything in between. So I thought we'd kick things off by really just defining what is addiction? What are the various types of addictions?
Great, I can start that off and Dr. Nadia, you can kick in. Essentially, I want to simplify tonight's conversation so we leave here really having some language that we can use, that we can recognize, that if we observe these things in conversations, that we can pick up on these really easily. So I'm going to break it down. An addiction is a need, whether it's perceived, physiologically, emotional, mental, there's a need or a drive to either consume or use something excessively. So if we talk about some common addictions, if we use that terminology, we can use excessively alcohol. So an alcohol addiction. We could use excessively, even in the case that food. So food can be an addiction. If we talked about other substances, those that are illegal, all substance abuse is not necessary, or all addiction is not necessarily something that would be illegal. Now, if we're talking about drugs like cocaine and other things, and whether we have this discussion about marijuana, but excessive consumption and overuse of it, even to the extent that it impacts you in a way that does not allow you to say no to it when it's affecting your life, when it's affecting your health, when it's affecting relationships, when it's affecting finances or income, so that the drive is so strong, it supersedes reasoning, it supersedes logic, it supersedes your own say-so, because the drive is insatiable and it continues to reinforce itself. So that's how I would say it, pretty simply put.
Yes, and I would just only add to that, the excessive use is always attributed to something going on in the individual's life that they're either avoiding or ignoring that they need some help with. And that could range from difficulty in relationships. That could range from the inability to effectively deal with stress or responsibilities, the experiences that one may have in their life that may have caused some trauma. And so there's always a connection to some experience that the individual may be avoiding dealing with.
Yeah, I love how you all highlighted too that not every addiction is something that's illegal. And I love the fact that we're going to spend some time talking about food addiction in particular, because we need food to sustain ourselves. And so that can be, I imagine, a very tricky addiction to manage. Before we get into the details of that, which I know Dr. Jada has a lot to tell us about this evening, which of the addictions that we talked about are diagnosable, if you know what I mean? I mean, which of these is that a physician is going to see you for in their office as an actual diagnosable addiction or condition?
Well, I can say a lot of times if we're talking about clinical conditions, things that would actually affect one clinically in your health and well-being. And so we broaden that. Health may be your physical health, emotional health, mental health. So those are the areas or the categories that would most likely show up in a physician's office. Now, if you're in a specialty office, specifically a psychiatrist or someone who really hones in on that specific area, that may broaden out a little bit more. For example, we use a diagnostic tool called the DSM-5. We're on the 5th edition, right, Nadia? The DSM-5. And so that is a diagnostic and statistics manual that has endured.
How did I know you would have it right there?
It has endured, like, I don't know how many editions of it, and it's constantly being updated and added to, because there are new things that are being added to it as addictions. For example, now we can say video addictions or social media addictions. Well, that wasn't a thing 20 years ago. Right? So if we get into this addictive space, as mentioned earlier, they all have similar patterns and similar, we see common behaviors, but who would actually specialize in that area? So the clinical addictions that we would see more often would be alcohol, drug addiction, food addictions, things that would be like pornography or sex addictions, pedophilia, those types of things would be more common. But other things that come up, even like work addictions.
Yes.
Y'all know workaholics exist.
Yes.
And I don't want to ask anybody to raise their hand if you think you might fit the criteria. So where do you go for that, though? Seriously, who would even diagnose that?
Right.
How would that come up? Because in the era of we're so busy and we don't have time for anything, and I got all of these deadlines to meet, and I got 1,000 emails unless I take vacation, so I don't take vacation. And you know what? Things are going on at home. My husband gets on my nerves. My kids are unruly. I live with my parents live with me. You know what? I'm better off at work than I am at home. Let me find some work to do.
Right.
So yeah, it's a thing.
And that kind of behavior then gets rewarded.
Yes.
The little dopamine receptors keep going off, because it's like, well, here, you know, our society says working yourself into the ground is what you should be doing. You know, people
Right.
bragging about never taking vacation, no days off. And, you know, we all know that that's not good for your well-being, but I do see how that can end up being another type of addiction.
Right. And here's the tricky question with that. Well, what's the reward at the end? What's the reward for what? Well, you get to avoid things that are uncomfortable. You get to avoid conflict. Many of us are addicted even to success.
Yes.
So we get the reward of yet another degree, another certificate, another accolade, another promotion, you know, somebody being the conversation of somebody else, you know, topic of somebody else's conversation. So we start to think about what is the reward. So when we talk about these dopamine centers, there are other behavioral, emotional awards or rewards or prizes that seemingly make us feel good enough to go back and repeat that cycle again.
Absolutely. And that would go with social media use. So we talk about, or there's accolades for individuals that have 1 million followers and what they have to do to have those 1 million followers or get more. And, but we have those individuals that's their goal. They're aiming to get this level of, international recognition for the videos or information they put out into the world that seems to have people want to know more. But that is also on the back end impacting their daily functioning because they're completely focused on wanting to get a reward for what they're doing, essentially.
So that brings me to my next question, which is this behavior learned? Is this something that, your children observe you doing or vice versa? Or is this something that's hereditary? Are we born with it?
Well, I believe that. Go ahead, Nadia. Go ahead, Doc.
I was just going to say, it's kind of like the chicken. What came first, the chicken or the egg? So, but yes, go ahead, Dr. Jada.
Well, for many of us, we may for those things that are non-clinical addictions, there are things that maybe at one point just made us happy and made us feel good. If you are a gamer and you like gaming and you feel good about it and you get to see these results really quickly and it boosts your confidence and then it energizes you and then it's this euphoric effect. And the next thing you know, all you want to do is spend time doing that. What started as a hobby has now affected the reward center in the brain so much so that it becomes excessive use. So these are people that don't get up, they don't get any sunlight, they spend hours on end sitting in a dark room and vision out, not even stopping to eat a meal, literally eating with fingers on the controller. So sometimes it's simple things that start out as things that we enjoy, that again, we separate ourselves or disconnect from those other parts of life that we don't always enjoy, those difficult parts. And when we cannot navigate those or choose not to or don't have the capacity, then what do? We look for a quick source of enjoyment. Even when we're having to do those things, we look for a quick source of enjoyment. So sometimes there can be hereditary. For example, alcoholism definitely is one of those things that we strongly know has a hereditary or genetic component. So especially for male to male. So we know that alcoholism is a thing that can be genetically passed along. So we start to watch that early. But guess what? Sometimes even the behavior of using alcohol is passed along early because this is okay in our family. This is what we do. So you have an adult cousin or uncle. We have that uncle that say, here, sip this, child. Ain't nothing wrong with this. See what you like.
Right.
And at 8 years old,
right,
that's the beginning of something.
Yep.
That may not have ever been realized, or maybe it would have been 10 years later or 20 years later. But here we go. So all of us have genetic predisposition to a number of things. Is that switch turned on, and how activated does it become?
And then along those lines, do we see a difference between boys, girls, men, women, when it comes to addiction?
So go ahead, Dr. Nadia.
I was just going to say, I think, it really depends on in connecting what we were talking about, the coping mechanisms that we learn. So as women, if you learn growing up that your, mother or major female person in your life always worked, then you're going to just say, okay, when I work and I don't take time for myself and I don't take time to deal with issues, I'm going to always go to work. So that kind of is developed. If you are, as it relates to maybe sex addiction as a young boy, if you are witnessed males in your life that continue to have special friends coming in and out of your life and never really deal with issues, then you're going to pick up, that's a coping mechanism that works, right? Because what we learn in our families is what's accepted. And if we find fault in these coping mechanisms, then we're saying that we find fault. And, it's almost like you're saying you're finding fault in your relatives when that's not necessarily the case. It's just what's a healthier behavior, and what are you trying to avoid? So I think it really depends on the coping mechanism, and if it's illegal drugs, sometimes the drug of choice.
Okay, thank you for that. That definitely makes sense and kind of feeds into that chicken or egg discussion. So we have talked a little bit about kind of recognizing addiction. There was a question in the chat about COVID-related trauma. It's a little bit unrelated to addiction per se, but how do we know how things get added to the DSM-5 that you mentioned? I just wanted to address that before we moved on to kind of talking about treatment options.
You want to take that, Nadia?
Yes. So continuous research is done on based on what's happening in our society, based on what society says is acceptable and not acceptable, which is why things continue to change. And so even though the DSM-5 is out right now, in the text, in the book, it says what are some things that are still being looked at to possibly add in the next version. So continuous research is being done across the board as it relates to in each of the different areas. So for addictions, other possibilities of addiction that we could see, which could be social media, it could be just, I'm sorry, I just went blank on that, but it's updated continuously. It's a working document. It's not set in stone. It's for what we are able to use right now, and it continues to be modified. So I would say in the next 10 years, there may be something related to COVID or related to being in a pandemic, maybe not necessarily with addictions, but maybe with anxiety, in the chapter or section on anxiety disorder. So
okay,
that's a great point. And may I just add one more thing? You mentioned COVID and addiction, and maybe I can tie it in to some extent, is what I'm seeing happen more. And this is not just me, but research is showing that we're seeing more as a result or during the pandemic, as a result of the pandemic, is that we are seeing a heightening in addictive behaviors, mainly because, again, people have adaptive coping mechanisms that are easy, simple, accessible. And so while one may have had these addictive tendencies or addictions in the past, work was a distraction. Having to drive the children around, travel for work, or traveling in general could be a distraction. So now when you take all of those things away and you're just simply in a controlled environment, what was distractible is now right here on your front porch or in your living room. So seeing an increase in substance use, particularly alcohol, is a thing, and particularly in women and in women professionals. So I was doing some research recently to look at the incidence of burnout, which is a different topic. But what we're seeing is professionals, specifically those who are attorneys, have a very high rate of substance abuse, particularly alcohol overuse. Those in dentistry, medicine, tax and accounting, those things, we're seeing a lot of upticking in professional places. So where we used to think addictive behaviors were only a certain subset of the socioeconomic sector, now we're seeing that not so much. And this is happening in people who can access it, who can afford it, who can hide it, who can, recover from it, who have the staffing in place to put somebody else in the front. See, if you're a laborer and you're supposed to be on the job doing X, Y, and Z, you can't send your coworker to say, go do my job too. So teachers, essential workers, absolutely. We are seeing an increase in those who are now using and perhaps even overusing these types of coping substances, including food. Food and alcohol are legal.
Yes.
So is using food as a comfort or stress eating considered an addiction?
So technically, food addiction may not necessarily be highlighted as food addiction in DSM-5. There are other eating disorders that are included in that, which I call consumptive or called consumptive eating disorders. Examples of that include binge eating disorder, night eating syndrome. I think we collectively think about stress eating or emotional eating as a subset, and it's really a set of behaviors and patterns around eating that are self-satisfying. They serve as a method of coping and relieving stress, relieving a sense of conflict, relieving situations or circumstances that causes one to feel unhappy or unfulfilled. And so what do we then want to do? We want to feel those feelings, and we want to feel them soon. Now, if we are talking about food addictions, there are criteria or symptoms that have been very consistent in terms of patterns and behaviors that make food addiction diagnosable. And some examples of that would be cravings that are uncontrollable, eating more than intended, eating past full, eating when you know that I'm full, but there's still a certain thing that doesn't feel satisfied about me. My belly is feeling satisfied, but I'm still on 10 emotionally. Feelings of eating until stuffed. I mean, to the extent, in some cases, this is stuff to the point of actually vomiting or feeling physically ill, and understanding that this has happened to me before, using this same pattern. So in other words, knowing what the destructive end is, I still am going to do it because this temporary reward is what is the priority or what supersedes. Hiding food intake, hiding food in the bedroom. Here's another one. Going through the drive-through line, going through 2 or 3 drive-through lines. So you over here, Popeyes, and then you leave Popeyes and go to Wendy's. And part of this is why. One is because these cravings are there, but the other is, well, I go through this drive-through often. I don't want them to look at me a certain way. So I'm going to order $20 worth of food here, $10 worth across the street. And another sign of that is not even waiting to get home, sitting in the parking lot, consuming these large amounts of food in hiding and in secrecy, because guess what's coming behind that? Feelings of guilt, feelings of shame. And so this temporary feeling that, I'm feeling satisfied in the moment, the brain knows, but I don't want other people to know that this is what's happening. So there are a number of things that can be in the background that may be little red flags that if you look at them in isolation, you could kind of like poo-poo them and blow them off. But if we really look at these collectively, we may be looking at a bigger issue, i.e. a food addiction.
Well, thank you for breaking it down like that. That was
Really
excellent. So I really appreciate that. I wanted to talk a little bit more, just still continuing to flesh out this discussion about kind of recognition of different types of addiction, and then segueing into some treatment. For example, going back to the social media topic, how do you then suggest that someone who's leaning on social media to remain social during a pandemic where we're isolated, and then they're using social media more to remain social, do they wean off of that? It's a little bit of oxymoron, I guess, because they're getting addicted but trying to remain social and be safe in this pandemic time.
I think it's important to look at what, not everyone on social media is doing the same thing. So it's one thing to be social, but are the activities or behaviors related to gaining attention? Is it related to and I say attention because I just think that that's majority of it. So there's a lack of attention in the individual's life, in their real life, that they are getting on social media, and that's a draw. And so really dealing with that, and dealing with, if we're talking about kids, having more, if it's a parent engaging with their child more. So you see your child is on social media a lot, or more than you would like. Those are opportunities for you to put in place some time where you are engaging with that child to set up boundaries, and you're indirectly communicating to the child that you need to have boundaries with everything that you enjoy. You can't do them all the time because you're going to have responsibilities, and really prepping that individual for life, whether it's work or whether you're in school. There needs to be a balance, and there needs to be a way for the child to learn internally how to put some stop points in place, or time frames in place. That could be very helpful. And
Well, I love that you brought up children. We had a question from the audience about how do you address some of these addictive behaviors? Perhaps you're witnessing unhealthy eating behaviors in your child, and you want to address it with your child, but then you don't want to potentially hinder their self-esteem. So, for example, stereotypically, we may think of eating disorders or food disorders as a female problem, but maybe you're noticing these things in your son. You want to address it, but not affect his self-esteem. Do you have any suggestions for that?
I would say the idea of what can we put in place? So if stopping the behavior isn't going to address the need for whatever the behavior is, the attraction to doing whatever that is. So if it's eating, what can we do to contribute to that individual putting that energy into something else? What is that individual or that child interested in? If the child is interested in sports, so maybe it's a matter of saying, hey, let's explore some healthier food options, or let's have a meatless Monday. Let's try to have, as a family, be supportive of changing our relationship with food, or changing our relationship with each other to really counteract some of those behavioral demonstrations that we as parents don't feel are going to be healthy in the future. Because it's not just, I need to tell my child you're eating too much, or I need to have them control their plates, say you can only eat this, you can only eat that, because I think restrictions aren't helpful as well. But it just may be a matter of, as a parent, putting more time and emphasis into helping your child to do better, which might mean looking at yourself, right? So if you are wanting your child to, be healthier, you can't also be the one going through the drive-throughs before you come home and have dinner, and they see the Burger King bag that you sneak it out your car, take it to the trash can real quick, and then you come in to have dinner. So I think the difficulty when it comes to children is that it automatically reflects on what are they learning from you as the parent or the guardian or the family. And so I think, as Dr. Jada shared about the experiences that one could go through with eating and overeating, I don't know about anybody on here, but it takes me back to every family Thanksgiving or every family dinner. It's expected. You need to clean your plate. You need to, big mom or grandma, she's not going to feel good until she knows that you are laid out on the couch with your belt unbuckled, saying, that food was so good. And so it really comes to, you have to change your whole perspective of things. And sometimes we're not ready for that either.
Oh yeah, you brought up some valid points there. I definitely remember my butt had to be glued to my seat until that plate was clean, and no matter if I was full. So I really think that was some good insight there. Dr. Jada, it looked like you were going to weigh in on that one too.
Yeah, well, I was just going to weigh in on food and food addictions and addictive patterns, and that those patterns, they are twofold. One is the behavior. So that's the tendency that creates the tendency around whether it's coping or just how we do life in our house. So that behavior gets repeated and repeated and repeated, and that is a pattern. Now, there's also the physiologic component of that. And it's really important to pay attention to that, because now you have a secondary reinforcement for this behavior. So let's use something, for example, like sugar. So if we're using sugar, and a little bit of sugar is good, a lot of sugar is great. So we end up, and I don't mean that, but I'm saying just how we have behaviors. So we eat 2 pieces of candy. Now we eat a bag of candy. Now we eat a roll of Thin Mints. Y'all be careful out there. I know some of y'all selling Girl Scouts. But what happens is those blood sugar levels will shoot up. And those blood sugar levels, do you know sugar is kind of even considered to have the same pathology or physiology as a drug like cocaine? So when it hits that part of the brain, it says, oh, that felt good. Mm-hmm. Give me more.
Right.
I want more of that. If a grown-up can't seem to handle that, what do you think a child with a developing brain is going to do in that experience, in that situation? But guess what? Now it's not only the neurotransmitters. Now it's not only the blood sugar, but now we get the neurotransmitters involved. Then guess what? We get insulin involved. So insulin is a pancreatic hormone that's a part of the metabolic pathway. And y'all stay with me, because I'm not going to go too deep into this biochemistry. What I'm really explaining to you is that the physiology will reinforce that same behavior. And the next thing you know, it becomes a vicious cycle. So now that the insulin levels spike up, guess what? You're going to end up with more fat storage. So now there's, the issue around storing fat. The body is going to crave more. Then you get into inflammation, and then we slide on over to here. After that insulin spike, guess what? The blood sugar is going to drop down. What happens when the blood sugar drops down? What's the first thing we want to reach for?
Candy.
I need to get a piece of candy. My sugar is low. Well, here we go again.
It's 2:00 in the afternoon. I need my sugar fix.
Sugar fix. So here we go again. Now we start this cycle all over again.
Vicious cycle. Mm-hmm.
It's a vicious cycle. And so there's some physiology that rewards that. And while I just described the sugar craving cycle per se, I see that again in people who are emotionally eating or stress eating. It's a little bit different. It's not always sugar, because, sometimes it could be other things that are overindulged but the cycle is, in those cases, let's just say the psychological or the behavioral reward is, I'm feeling stressed. Oh my gosh, can you believe what happened? Can you believe what they said to me? Can you believe this, or my bills, or whatever it is? And so the body is saying, well, what makes us feel good? Because I'm over this sensation. So then you get that feel good. And so there's a moment of satisfaction and even a moment of elation. So that satisfaction and that elation. So then there's that decompression. But right behind that are those feelings of remorse, guilt, and shame.
And I
So
think
what
across the board. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So then what follows that? That's so stressful. Now I don't feel so good about myself. Oh, I'm bad. I can't even do this. And before you know it, there's a snowball effect. It went from the food. It went from the fight to the food to now I'm just not a good person. I can't handle, my own stress, or now I can't. And then you start to feel bad about yourself. What happens next? You think of other bad stuff. By the way, I'm behind on my bills, or by the way, I could be doing this. By the way, my grandmother's sick. By the way, you just think of things to now add. It's a snowball effect, and it starts all over again.
We have a couple of questions on this topic from Facebook. So thank you to you that have submitted those questions. So let's say you are able to identify a bit of a food addiction, maybe even an alcohol addiction. What are some of the first steps that you can take to potentially eradicate this addiction? And then let's say it's not even an addiction. What if you're just wanting to create some healthier habits or better relationship with food? Like, what is that first step you need to take?
So one of the important things in this whole cycle is just the recognition that this is not safe. This is not healthy. And when I say healthy, I'm not necessarily referring to the quality or the caliber of the food at this point. This food relationship, my ability to use food in a way. And even I have some people that say that they love food. And to love something that does not have the capacity to love you back, there is no even exchange. There is nothing that creates any exchange or reciprocity, real reciprocity in this relationship. So to acknowledge that this has gotten to a point where I no longer have the capacity to manage this alone. I've tried. I want to. I wish I could. I prayed about it. I've eliminated foods from my home. Yet I find myself repeating these behaviors. So that's going to be the first thing, is to recognize. The second thing is going to be the moment that you recognize, to swiftly source help, or what I call source support. Because it is very, very challenging to manage an addiction to the extent that it goes into remission alone. So we can't remember, I mentioned that some of it is behavioral. So we do want to get with a mental health professional. We do, whether that's a therapist, a counselor, a substance abuse specialist. So those are really important. And then there's also getting the physical component of it, getting with someone that can help with that physical component. And this also includes children, because the question came up of how do I address this? I recognize it now as a parent, but I'm afraid to say something. And I do get parents like that. One is because they were that child. They were that child that was once overweight and was talked to with other siblings at the table. Okay, you got 3 siblings. You can get this. You can get potatoes, peas, and chicken. And you can get, you're just going to have salad because you already weigh too much. So being able to sit there and see the difference in how one was treated. Well, that's an impression. Nadia mentioned trauma earlier. All trauma doesn't hurt physically. So there are emotional pains that have been covered over or surfaced over, and they are there. Just because you threw dirt on it and thought you buried it does not mean it's not there. So I would say it's important to, as a parent, to get help sometimes in those conversations, because you're right. I'm a mom too. I don't want to say something that would be damaging to my child for the long haul. So how can I get help? If help is not that easily accessible to you, what I always say with parents is just start making the shifts in your household. You don't have to have a long, drawn out family meeting and discussion and conversation about how, okay, starting tomorrow, we're all going to eat healthy. Bring the food in and cook it. Don't go through the drive-through. Don't, start to shift the behaviors for everybody. So it normalizes it. And it is not going to hurt a person who does not have a weight problem to eat fresh fruits and vegetables. So some of those things are just to change or to shift how the family dynamics operate, and always be mindful of what other things are behind your child's eating patterns. So we, again, even as adults, we recognize that we eat for reasons. So, children do the same thing. So if you have a child that's being bullied, you have a child that doesn't feel good about themselves, you have a child that's witnessed abuse, verbal, who's all kinds of things, that feels like they're not the favorite child, all of those things, the best way to get ahead to deal with emotional eating is to get in front of the emotion. If you are always trailing and following it, it's always reactive. Get in front of it. If you want to manage or deal with emotional eating, deal with the emotion.
And that could be challenging, right, for a parent who may know what the issue is, and maybe, it's difficult for you still seek help. You can still seek out assistance to help you with dealing with getting in front of the emotion and identifying how you get help for yourself and allow you to get help for your child, and so that you can work together with that. I definitely feel, in terms of alcohol and substance abuse, people aren't going to intentionally do something to hurt themselves. So if someone is doing or using illegal drugs or alcohol to deal with problems, just know that there are definitely problems. And what you're seeing, which is the addiction, isn't the problem, to get at the core of addressing how to get this person some help. And so whether that is trauma, whether that is, self-esteem or difficult relationships, all of those things that I would say the majority of us do a good job in coping with, because we all have our own experiences that we are having to work through and deal with. But you have individuals that struggle with it. And, just like we're all in here in living through this pandemic, but there are some that are struggling living through this pandemic. And, choosing to put toxins in your body isn't what people would normally do. In terms of hurting themselves. But it goes back to what Dr. Jada shared in reference to that immediate self-gratification of feeling good. Someone that desires to feel good about just to have that feeling, and in desperation are going to do whatever it takes to feel good. They're still going to have the cyclical emotions of regret and remorse and it feeling bad, and then it goes back around to just wanting to feel good, but really getting at how can we, in terms of treatment, is how can we help this person learn other ways to feel good without using these substances or alcohol.
Yeah, so kind of putting some of the things that you guys have said together, we talked a little bit about healthcare workers and some of the stress that they're feeling with the pandemic. I think a lot of us have heard of this term, the Great Resignation, and people leaving the workforce, having high rates of burnout, not having the typical outlet strategies that they've had in the past. Do you think that these are the contributors to seeing some of this increase in addictive behaviors in healthcare workers that you mentioned, Dr. Jada?
Well, I think a good part of it, comes from your baseline. Because in these circumstances with healthcare workers who may have already been in difficult work environments, in difficult work schedules, and all of those things. And then when that's compounded, there becomes a tipping point, and that's for anybody really, no matter what the profession is. So I think what that speaks to is good baseline mental wellness, good baseline emotional wellness, good baseline physical wellness, so that our starting point gives us some reserve for those times when extra burden or extra work or extra things, that conflicts are brought our way. We have some capacity there. When we wear away chronically at capacity and you throw a pandemic on top of it, then there's just a point of reference that's difficult to rise above and beyond. So then what do? We go to the simple, the quick, the accessible, and even the historical. There may be things that, this may be a pattern that you had kicked, had arisen above, had found some happier, more fulfilling things to do, and resorting back to this type of behavior. Examples include people who had stopped smoking, haven't smoked for 10 or 15 years. This method of coping has now gotten, this is what they know. And so it is, I think, the strength of your baseline. And we saw that even if we talk about the pandemic, those that were hit the hardest, in other words, those who were more likely to be hospitalized, those who were more likely to have complications, and those who were more likely to have a lethal outcome, were people who had a poorer baseline state of health. So this speaks to us not being in crisis management when it comes to our health and well-being as a plan A, but how do I fortify my life, my lifestyle, the people around me, the things that I have, the things that I need, the things that I don't need? How do I manage those in a way that sets me up to be powerful in times of difficulty, rather than to succumb to that tipping point when it hits, and this was the last straw?
Yeah, you are, look, choir here. I love this. My professional work, I try to teach our residents. Residents are physicians who are in the early part of their training, for those of you who may not be aware. And I spend a lot of time talking about physician wellness and well-being. And so thank you for highlighting a lot of those points, because I think you're right. If we can build up that reserve, that resilience that everybody always talks about, that's going to help you hopefully have a good menu of options that you can tap into before needing to, or hopefully not needing to, resort to substance use. For those who maybe don't have that baseline well-being and end up using drugs and alcohol as a coping strategy, can we talk a little bit about who specifically they should go to for help? Or let's say I'm a family member and I recognize my cousin or whomever has an alcohol problem. Who do I specifically tell them to go to for help? And then if we think that they're doing this because of mental health issues, how do the substances then affect their ability to have effective treatment for whatever underlying mental health issues are going on?
Well, okay. In terms of who to go to, you can go to your primary care doctor as a place to start. If an individual doesn't know of a mental health facility or center to go to, if you have mental health facilities in your area that may be connected with your hospital system, you can go there. And all of the mental health evaluations, which include substance and alcohol, starts with just an initial assessment of what's going on in the individual's life, and questions related to the amount and the frequency of use. If you are a family member, go with the person. That could be helpful to them, to have somebody there with them that can be involved in their level of treatment. Now, if an individual has mental health and substance or alcohol abuse issues, those can be treated all together. There are places that individuals can go, special addiction facilities or clinics that will also support mental health treatment as well. So if that is being on medications, if that's having a therapist, if that's going to specific substance abuse supportive groups, or having a specific substance abuse counselor to work with that individual, it's all occurring. And so treatment can also be co-occurring as well at the same time. So it's not a matter of, do you have to treat one first or before the other? No, we're going to focus on treating the whole individual at the same time. And I would also include that treatment will also impact their physical health. They may have a nutritionist. They may, have be connected with a nurse or nurse practitioner who will follow up with them physically for any medical illnesses that the individual will also have. And so that would, in terms of the picture of what treatment can look like, that's kind of a generalized treatment. But I do want to say the individual has to be motivated to get the help. If the individual is not at the point of motivation, then success will be very difficult.
So along those lines, then, do people feel like ambushed if you stage an intervention, as we, sometimes hear about? I know you said it's helpful to go with a family member. Should that be one-on-one? Should that be a group of family members? Any thoughts about that?
I think when of course there's that show Intervention, and it's popular, and I think it could be helpful for an individual to see how their support system loves them and wants the best for them. The difficulty comes in when the person is not included in the help. So it's because I want you to stop, not necessarily are you at the point where you're ready to stop. It's almost like it doesn't matter what that person wants. This is not healthy, and I think we need to make them. Well, sometimes that can push a person who may be in denial about their amount or frequency of use. They may be in denial and think that they're or maybe they're aware and maybe they've been hiding it, and they think that they're doing a great job hiding it, and they're not ready to deal with getting help. In order to get help, you have to be able to swallow and accept that you have engaged in behaviors and physically become engaged in behaviors that aren't doing you justice, even though when you're in the midst of it, it feels great. It is helping you in the midst, but ultimately it's hurting you. And it can take a while for a person to get to the place of this is a behavior that definitely needs to stop. And so you really have to consider where that person is in their addiction, in that process. And this might sound crazy, but give them some grace with where they are, but talk about it. Allow them to let them know that you see this happening. You don't want that for them. You love them. Talk about it with them so they know they're not hiding it, and it's not making people that you love feel good for you.
Can I add something to that too? I think that was great, Nadia, and some really great points. One of the things that I think is important for us as family members, as loved ones, as friends, as caregivers, to realize that when you are dealing with someone who has an addiction or substance abuse disorder, that you are not speaking to the individual. their addiction is their representative. So the ration and the reason and the, the cajoling and the coercing, you are not speaking to that person. It is not that person that is rejecting that notion of how much you love. It's the addiction, and the addiction doesn't speak the same language. It doesn't have the same ground rules. You're not going to get the same response from that individual that your heart desires. And it can be very challenging to stand by. It's painful to watch, and it's let alone painful to, stage or be a part of an intervention that just flops. It just doesn't go well. And then that could be very difficult for you as the person that's standing in the gap for that person. So this expectation that a deep, heartfelt conversation is going to turn this around is not the way it works. That's not the addiction. That the addiction doesn't negotiate that way. So you have to understand that. So my next step would be to this: whether or not the person is willing to step into that space of understanding that this is life-threatening for me. I'm about to lose my house. I'm about to lose my wife. I'm about to lose my husband. I'm about to lose my siblings. I'm about to lose my job, because addiction says, it'll be all right. Do this right now. And so for those times that you can't seem to get that person out of that, it may be you that needs to get help. You could be the person that goes to say, how do I manage myself in the household with a person that is living with an experience in addiction? Because one of the things you don't want to do is get caught up into a codependent trap. And then that brings your mental health and emotional health and financial health and relational health, and it takes it. And so it's all going down together. It's like, trying to save someone that doesn't want to be saved. And so we're all kind of struggling. So there are two places that I like to say, if you cannot access these sources that Nadia mentioned, consider some national organizations or outreach. One is the National Alliance for Mental Illness, NAMI, and they have chapters all over the country that is there to support families and individuals who are dealing with mental illness, and mental illness that may also be occurring with a substance abuse condition. So that's one. The other one is SAMHSA. Did I get it right? SAMHSA. So that's Substance and Mental Health, whatever, association. So that is another option as well. And those organizations do also have programs and services for people who are or underinsured. So and can point you in the direction. And we have to, realize that these are not comfortable conversations. These are not comfortable steps of outreach, because quite frankly, you may be clutching your pearls like I never, and maybe you haven't, but this is where we are right now. And so what is the next best step? What is required next? And so we have to put pride aside, and we have to really just do what it takes, even if that means going to your community service board, your CSB. That's the county, y'all. The county has services for those who are in need. And so those are some resources that I would suggest, and every county has one, as some starting points if you're really having difficulty sourcing support from an access and even a socioeconomic or affordability standpoint.
I want to add one more thing to that, in reference to what I hope I'm not saying is support individuals by saving them from consequences. So if your loved one who through their addiction is about to lose their house, what I'm not saying is to put yourself in a situation where you're trying to save them from not losing their house. If a loved one is about to lose their job, then they just have to lose their job. There are consequences to behaviors, and that goes across the board, whether it's a person that has a mental health issue, a severe mental health issue, or a person that has an addiction. We live in a society where we have to have consequences to behaviors that are not in the best interest of how we can all operate together. So if they are being arrested for whatever reason, don't go bail them out. They need to have that experience. If they are, going to, I'm a person that believes consequences can also be a good teacher. And sometimes that no amount of love can help that person see a different way. And sometimes an additional motivating factor could be what's happening based on the behaviors that are related to these consequences. As Dr. Jada mentioned, addictions are stronger than the love you have for the person. So just understand that you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you're fighting a losing battle. Take care of yourself in the interim, but also, working through getting your own help, figure out how that you can help the person as well.
Thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. I think you're right. A lot of us, if we see these behaviors in loved ones, we want to jump to the rescue, and then we might be in our own, crisis. So that's very good feedback. The chat is blowing up. So thank you all for really engaging in this very important topic. Dr. Jada, this one is for you. I know you said you didn't want to go too much into biochemistry, but someone in the chat really liked that biochemistry and wanted you to go a little bit more into the biochemistry as it relates to this drug addiction and those chemical changes that may happen in the brain, or even with like diabetes and the sugar addiction that you talked about. How does that then create chemical changes in the brain?
Well, thank you for that question. And to simplify that, what happens is that the brain and the body is an amazing, amazing, amazing phenomenon. And the body wants you to be well, and it wants you to be happy. And to the extent that it will compensate, and in cases even overcompensate, to ensure, at least for the moment, that it is maintaining what's called homeostasis, or a stable static point. Now, when you get into these behaviors, there are chemicals, as we mentioned, in the brain. We talk about some of the happy chemicals or neurotransmitters. So we think about dopamine, which is really reactive. Dopamine likes to jump in, and it likes to be stroked or increased like that. It's like the thing that just, it wants to jump in and be on stage, be the life of the party from time. There are some other neurotransmitters in the brain that like to maintain a certain state of well-being and a certain state of physical satisfaction. Maybe that hormone is serotonin. So we think about maintaining a healthy appetite that's not too high, not too low. So feeling full at a time, feeling satisfied at a time when that chemical communicates with chemicals in the gut. See, it's all a system that works really well together when it's working really well together. So that serotonin also helps us with sleep. It also helps us with mood. It also helps us to some extent with energy. So when that marker is off, well, what's going to come to the rescue? That chemical is low. So what's going to replace that? Well, sometimes we miss these signals in our body. So we'll replace them with things that we know about. So caffeine or coffee or, chocolate or things that we take in to do a pick-me-up. Well, then a lot of consumptions of these things end up affecting another organ that ain't even in the brain. It's over here sitting on top of the kidneys. It's the adrenal glands. So we wear the adrenal glands out. So those don't send out the signals that it used to. And guess what? It was already tired anyway, because all of these lists of stressors that you've been going through, you lost your job, Then you got into some marital issues. We're talking about psychosocial stressors. Okay, so that means biological, psychological, social, and psychological and social stressors, things that happen in our world that affect us. So there's a long list of those: divorce, illness, job loss, even a new job or promotion. If that shows up as a challenge or a difficulty, single parenting, co-parenting, getting married can even be a psychosocial stressor. Even if you've been single for 39 years and got married, and now you're taking on this, it can be because it represents change. Other things, illness, having a family member move in, becoming a primary caregiver, becoming a parent, losing a child, losing a parent, losing a pet. All of these things are psychosocial stresses, and they weigh on our body's system that manufactures epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol. So there are a lot of different neurotransmitters, and I haven't even tapped on those that help us with balancing appetite, ghrelin, serotonin. So I don't want to go too far into it, but what I want the take-home message to be is that there's a physical phenomenon that's going on that will dance with those behaviors, and they may even partner up to constantly reinforce one another. Was that a lot?
Oh, yeah, no, that was excellent. Look, the med school geek in me I was loving all of that. Remember the 5-HT receptors, all of that. Right. So one of our audience members wrote just how much she loved this discussion. Thank you so much. And she's a self-proclaimed alcoholic and has commented that dopamine is a hell, and is wondering that if, she has loved ones who are or recovering or are in the midst of addiction, what's the best way of supporting them without then getting sucked into enabling them, as you, Dr. Nadia, or potentially caregiving to an extent that you are now struggling? And I know you touched on this a little bit, but just to bring it all in.
You have to know your boundaries. You have to know what are the lines that if you cross, it's going to put you at more of a risk to engage in coping mechanisms that aren't helpful or that you intend to do. And then with those boundaries, you have to stick to the boundaries. Do not expect that you communicate to your family or friends what your boundaries are and they're going to respect that. And I mean that, from the bottom of my heart. They still love you, but those are your boundaries and you have to protect them and you have to stick with them. So I would, think about ways that you can support that also keeps you within your boundaries, where you can remain healthy and you can remain in a space where you have a reservoir that you can pull from if need be, and work within those boundaries. And if you have feelings of guilt or feelings of shame or feelings of negative feelings as to putting boundaries in place, I would also recommend that you get a therapist to talk through that. Everyone talks about self-care and we know how we talk about it, but what we don't talk about is how difficult it can be to actually implement, because we may have feelings of that we're selfish, or that we have resources or we have things that we could help others, but it's to our own detriment. And, what does that really mean about me as a person? That's a space you can talk it out with, a therapist, or with, some good friends that you have that can really support you in maintaining your boundaries despite maximizing all of your resources to help other people.
Yeah, I think boundaries and limiting those has been definitely a huge struggle, especially those that are working from home there often aren't the boundaries of leaving the workplace and going back into your home to be able to set those boundaries. So I think that mentioning that word in general is very, very useful for our audience members. I know you keep talking about support. So we've talked about some food addiction. We've talked about more serious substance use addiction. What if we notice some of these lesser recognized addictions, like we may have mentioned gaming, for example? How can we support friends or family who have children who are just glued to their tablet, potentially having to do virtual school, and then parents are home on meetings, but we're seeing that the kids are really addicted to gaming and their devices? And I have a part 2 to that question once you answer.
You know,
Well,
go ahead. Yes, no. Go ahead, Dr. Jada.
Well, one of the things, especially working with children and behaviors, a lot of times our first instinct would be, I'm just going to take the tablet away, or I'm just going to take and so we get into a punitive position, and there's resistance there. So one of the strategies to do is to replace it with something that's so yummy and it's so great, and it may be an inconvenience to, because see, what happens is you get used to them being quiet with that tablet too. So now to shift that behavior is going to require you to shift your behavior. So while the child has a gaming addiction, guess what? The parent has a work addiction. They're constantly on their emails and finishing projects and working on reports. So their addiction is no different from yours. You just get paid for yours. So really, seriously though, is to replace that. So when you start to put in things that have a high reward ticket, then it becomes easier to shift towards that high reward behavior. And so we increase that ticket on the things that work well, the things we want to see, so that we reduce the interest of and the value of the ticket that we have that we're stepping away from. Does that make sense? In food language, I call that crowding in. So rather than saying cut out your carbs, cut out your this, cut out your everything, because see, those restrictive behaviors send a negative feedback loop. And for some people who may have experienced punishment or neglect or abandonment or those things in earlier years, that there's an internal dialogue that you don't even know is playing, then sometimes that could be even worse. So crowd in the things that work really well so that you can kind of step away from the things that don't with a little bit more ease.
Thank you. No, that's wonderful advice. I'm taking notes as a parent myself. So part 2 to that question is, how do you recognize when too much is too much? So one of our audience members commented that there was a friend of hers who had a child who was very addicted to gaming, but lo and behold, he started getting checks in the mail as an e-gamer. In fact, he was able to then purchase a car and a home for his mother because of all of the money he made from gaming. So how do you then kind of address that addiction when it then comes with a reward that benefits the family, et cetera, and the person?
Well, I could say in that instance, sometimes those situations, first of all, are not as common as the opposite of those, which is wasting your time and flunking out of school. But, if you do it excessively, let's just say, and I say that, say it to the opposite of this is a situation where you can maybe equate this to studying. So let's say if he were in college and he was spending this much time studying, we say he was addicted to study. Well, there was a positive outcome from it. It is not hurting or harmful or unhealthy to that person. They're able to use that for another greater good. There's now there may be some sacrifice in terms of relationships and communication. However, this may not show up as something that is dysfunctional to the point that it creates distress. So that's when you start to look at addictive behaviors, is that it becomes dysfunctional and creates distress. That distress may be financial, that distress may be relational, because if you are using cocaine and saying, hey, well, I got this, I don't have no problem with this, I can actually deal, I can make some more money, but it causes you to step outside of what is a comfortable, reasonable, healthy existence, and now it is causing distress, then that's a different situation. So if we take it back to those kind of lesser crimes, if you will, like gaming or videos or even pornography, if you wanted to say that, well, one could say, well, what's it to anybody else if I pay my money to, I'm not going to use me as an example, as a person pays their money to have their pornography on demand and they enjoy it, then what's it to anyone else? It's available. They paid for it. They didn't steal it. However, if you get to a point where it's affecting your intimacy or it's affecting your relationship, or now you don't relate or don't see another person that's in your life as your partner. So communication breaks down. Your desire for that partner breaks down. And depending on what the pornography, depending on how you look at it, is that somebody that's underage? So now is that creating something? If you were to act on it this time, would that be okay? Would that be healthy? Would it be safe? Would it be legal? So when you start to set yourself up for untoward effects or things that could cause dysfunction, distress, and disaster, then you may want to check that out. You got something to say on that, Dr. Nadia?
I completely agree with what you shared. And it goes back to a comment that you made earlier with regards to when people say they love food or when they love to play gaming, they're loving something that cannot give them any emotional connection in return. And that's damaging, because you think, whether it's a child or an adult, you think about at the times when they are then wanting some real person connection, now they have difficulty making the connection because they can make the connection with an inanimate object or a thing. And therein lies some challenges that may show up later.
That's a great point. And that's a great point is if we circle back around to social media and social media consumption. Now, some people do it for a living, and sometimes even that could be but social media consumption, to the extent that it takes you out of the reality of your own life situation, or it creates a perception that is unreal. The perception that everybody else's life is perfect, because those are the people you keep following, and you keep following those and they keep putting more of those. If you go back and really think about and look at and study, there's a movie out now that talks about the psychology of social media and how this is really changing brain patterns. It's literally changing brain patterns. And so if you really think about the buy-in that it requires to interact and engage, it can make you almost socially inept, because you're in a fantasy or a simulated environment that does not actually exist. So when it is required upon, people do this with dating. They on the dating app and they're good. Now you meet up and y'all can't speak. Y'all don't have anything to talk about.
Right. Absolutely.
Well, I wanted to start to bring things home with one final question. And we're also going to post a survey on both the Facebook page as well as in our chat. We'd love for you all to fill it out. I wanted to bring it home talking about food one last time.
Okay.
And really, I know that is your baby here. Talking about, for those who have an unhealthy relationship with food, are there similar resources like NAMI, Alcoholics Anonymous, etc., that a person can reach out to for help? Or is there like a medical route? Should they be looking into help from their physician if, for example, they were kind of always told they were big as a child, and now even though as an adult they're not eating as much, they still don't have a great relationship with food?
So yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And so when I'm working with clients and we're looking at deconstructing how we got here, sometimes we are talking about the past, childhood, things like that, also current behaviors, and then the physiology of what is so now. So when you are sourcing a professional, I would definitely say always seek a medical professional in addition to, or, a professional in general. So if I'm working with someone, though, I need to really, really delve in deeply on what is this. Remember, we talked about behavior and physiology. What are these? How are they interplay? And how do we deal with it at that level? There are some people that are out there that also specialize in medical bariatrics like I do, or medical or non-surgical weight loss, or metabolic medicine. You just have to source those. It's not a lot, I'll be honest with you. We're starting to see more people who are going through the additional training with the American Board of Obesity Medicine. That's the certifying body that I use. And so there's training that's happening and people are going into that. A lot of times people mistake that bariatric surgery is that counterpart, and that is not the case. Surgery is a thing. It is one thing. It does not necessarily address all of the physiologic components that will still remain even after bariatric surgery, or any type of cosmetic surgeries have been done. That physiology don't play. So whatever those hormones and chemicals and barometers in the stomach, all of those things, they still have to be managed. So definitely seeking a professional source that specializes in this. Now, what are some of those resources? If you can't, find a Dr. Jada, or you can't find another doctor in the area, what are some other resources on the behavioral side? Of course, Overeaters Anonymous, and those are everywhere. Not everywhere, but they are in places all across the country. A lot of times I see them being in faith-based organizations, so they may be hosted at churches and things like that. So if someone could post their Overeaters Anonymous, and there are other eating disorder centers that one could source as well. So those are specifically, and sometimes inpatient. I'll say really quickly that most of the time we've thought about eating disorders as anorexia or bulimia. So those are the restrictive eating disorders, but there are a number, I didn't talk a lot about it tonight, but there are a number of consumptive eating disorders. And so that could be the case, especially with kids. Sometimes those are even have a genetic or component. There could be genetic deficiencies in children that result in early and long-standing obesity. So you need somebody who can understand that. So those are some of the sources that come to mind right off top of my mind. Nadia, you got stuff?
Hold on a second. No, you hit the nail on the head, and I actually was thinking of another topic that I'd love for you to be a part of in the future. So we'll talk offline. But yeah, those are
thank you.
Great websites.
Thank you so much. I tried to drop the links for as many of those resources as possible in the chat. You can also feel free to email us at pmh@asacdst.org if you did not catch the links in the chat. We are now going to display the QR code, and I just want to give you all a rousing round of applause. We had lots of comments in the chat, if you didn't see them, about this being powerful information, very useful information, awesome content, etc. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We really appreciate you, both Dr. Nadia and Dr. Jada.